My name is Joe Forte. I work for Virginia Tech Publishing in the university libraries at Virginia Tech, and we're talking about the American Soldier Project. I'm talking right now with Dr. Edward Gitre, who is an assistant professor of history at Virginia Tech and who is the project director for the American Soldier Project, which is completing its phase of crowdsourcing the transcriptions of survey responses for American soldiers during World War II. So I thought we'd begin by talking about that, the completion of this crowdsourcing phase. How big an accomplishment is this, Dr. Gitre?
It is, it's really monumental. When we set up the project on Zooniverse, we were really optimistic and ambitious that we could complete all the transcriptions in a 2-year period. And we did that because we had applied for an NEH grant, a 2-year implementation grant. And so our hope was that during the year period while we were waiting to see if we were going to get the funding, that we would, after a startup grant from the NEH that helped us set everything up, during that 1 year, a gap year, that we would continue our transcription drive, but finish it the first year of the implementation grant were we to receive it. That way, during the second year of this grant, that we would have all of these transcriptions done and start to build the website, which would launch in that second year. So everything was really tightly constrained by the schedule, and it was really ambitious, but based on the initial launch, we felt really good, like that it was going to be a lot of work and it would take sustained effort. But based on the positive response from our original Transcribe-a-thon on VE Day in 2018, we think this is doable. And so here we are 2 years later, and we've completed it with a week to spare. At first I thought earlier in the year 2020 rather, that it might carry over into a little into the summer. But as a result of the stay-at-home orders here and elsewhere, there's been a bump on Zooniverse, not only with my project, with the American Soldier, but across projects on Zooniverse, because so many people are at home working. So because of that contribution, we finished ahead of time. And what that amounts to is we have 65,000 handwritten documents, and each document is transcribed 3 times, and that's to get the best output, the highest quality output. And we're going to go through a reconciliation process. So we're talking close to 200,000 individual entries transcribed and annotated. So that's a lot of transcribing.
Wow, it certainly is. So the triple checking, is that specifically because you're dealing with handwritten responses and they are very difficult to decipher at times?
Right. So there are different methods out there for improving or editing. Some processes use a human eye, so you'll have one transcription that someone then edits or confirms, verifies. The way that the Zooniverse works is through repetition. And so what you do is you implement what's called the retirement count. And based on a survey of other projects, we felt pretty good about having 3. You can have up to 10. Now the platform is evolving, and they're working on some other tools to allow for more collaborative transcribing and editing, but it's not quite there yet. So the idea is that we've got these 3, and we'll use an automated process to then look for agreement across the transcriptions and select the best one or combine. So we're fine-tuning that process right now using an undergraduate student here at Virginia Tech, and we feel pretty good having looked at the initial passive results. We're in discussions about further editing the work this year, and in the final website there will be an edit. There is going to be an option to do more editing. because this is a problem across transcription projects, as you can imagine, because of the difficulty of reading other people's handwriting, either because of the script or the quality of the scans. So this is something that a lot of different people are working on, and we're part of that general conversation of how we can improve the results.
So Zooniverse, that's the platform on which the folks could navigate to Zooniverse and participate in the project. Could you say a little bit about the partnership with Zooniverse?
I found out about Zooniverse while our, we were still in the 1 year period of our startup grant. And I came across it, and immediately when I saw the site, I was really impressed. Because Zooniverse has been around for a while. It is known for its citizen science projects, crowdsourcing projects. When I came to it, other fields were contributing projects, and when I first went to the website and looked at the history projects, I noticed that there were several military history war related projects. And one of the things that really impressed me about Zooniverse was just the ease of use. And I had that the forefront of my mind because my first audience, the first contributors were going to be students here at Virginia Tech. And so when I'm teaching classes of say 40 students or a couple of sections, that's a lot of students. And you don't want to have a lot of technological issues or barriers that they have to work through in order to use a platform. So the ease of use, the fact that there were other projects on the platform that had parallel content in a way, those things were really attractive. But then just the large user base. I think at this point, Zooniverse has close to 2 million members. So it's the largest, most popular transcribing of not just transcribing, but crowdsourcing platform on the planet. So knowing that I had 65,000 documents, I wanted to get them transcribed in a relatively short period of time. Knowing that there were lots of people, the public, who were interested in World War II, had some personal connection, it just was a really natural fit. And so we worked with Zooniverse on setting up the project, creating workflows using a graduate student here at Virginia Tech in computer science, who was funded by the NEH grant. And we launched later that spring of our first year, after we went through Zooniverse's review process. So they have on the platform, they have a project builder that lets anybody create their own project on the platform. So there was no special collaboration that we had to enter in to build the front end of it. It was basically they had this capability on the platform already, and we had the skills on our side to set it up. So there was a lot of fine tuning of the workflows, but once we set the ship a sail, it took off.
And I want to talk more about the crowdsourcing aspect of this phase of the project because it's one of the things that makes the project unique, and it's what we're celebrating here in this upcoming VE Day. But before we get into that further, can we step back and talk about the project more generally? So you're transcribing responses from that soldiers taking surveys during World War II hand wrote these responses. But could you say something about the context of that survey? Like who's giving it, who's taking it, what was the thinking behind the creation of that, and then a little bit maybe about how those sources were treated following the war.
Yeah. So in 1940. These measuring techniques for getting the pulse of the public and understanding public opinion was really coming into its own, and magazines were using them, major magazines, but you have political parties, lots of people, businesses, commercial interests were using polling techniques. So it was really coming into its own, and there were social behavioral scientists who saw the growth of the Army and the preparation for war as an opportunity to use these techniques on behalf of the Army and the war effort. There was some internal resistance to using polling among soldiers, as you might imagine. Uh, but there are some really strong advocates within the Army. And the basis of it, other than just applying these techniques to the Army, was really the nature and the character of the Army during World War II. From the president on down, they talked about America's Army being a citizen soldier force and a democratic army. So there was a really direct connection between the way they talked about the individual soldier and the techniques that were developed to understand who is the American soldier. So the Army internally created an in-house social and behavioral science research unit that was tasked with improving soldier morale, with the idea that better adjusted soldier would make for a stronger, more effective and efficient fighting force collectively. And over the course of the war, this unit surveyed 500,000 soldiers and some other civilians. And what this looked like is that they would interview them or survey them, and there would be a whole battery of mostly multiple choice questions. But at the end, in the majority of these surveys, there would be just a blank rule sheet of paper and an opportunity for the individual soldier to write whatever they wanted. And two really crucial pieces of this puzzle help to explain why these are so unique. One is that these were anonymous, and so there was no fear. I mean, some people were skeptical, some soldiers, whether there was really anonymous, but there wasn't a fear of retribution or a commanding officer reading these and knowing who wrote what. The second was that they were uncensored in connection to that. And so we know so many sources from World War II are censored, either self-censored or officially censored, and these weren't. What happened is, after the war, they preserved a large collection of these individual responses and transferred them to microfilm, 44 microfilm rolls, and had them preserved, and then also a large portion of the survey data, and that's what we're working with. So the idea is that we're bringing these sources back to life, bringing them back together and making them accessible to the public for the first time since the war.
Yeah. So my experience with the transcribing I did is just what you say. That, I mean, you really get a sense that the respondents are not fearing consequences, and they're not holding back. There's an honesty that suggests they believed these to be anonymous surveys, which is great. But what was there demographic data collected around the responses that kept the identity of the soldier private while giving some sense of potentially what sector of the population their opinion represented?
Yeah, so they would have, the surveyors would have access to their military records, and they use those records in order to identify who they would survey, because they did a lot of cross-sectional surveying. So they wanted to find representative members of, so they had a system in place for that, but they also had access to census data and other records. And in the surveys themselves, they would ask them some demographic data questions, like their education, their occupation. And so they had, the researchers basically had a mountain of data to work with, both from the individual surveys, but also military and other government records, to have a pretty complete picture of who these people were. And so in terms of the cross-section, they wouldn't necessarily look for specific demographic data, but the idea was to get as much of a cross-section of a particular regiment or a snapshot of a particular period of time to be as comprehensive as they could be.
Yeah, so a citizen soldiers, a democratic fighting force. This is that comes across as well, right? You can tell these aren't folks, that they are just people talking about the experience of being in the Army. They're not professional soldiers. It certainly comes across. To what
Yeah.
degree do you think there was a sense of um, a measuring the value of an army like that is drawn from the citizenry and some by some sort of democratic process and an emulation of some sort of democratic society, um, and or to what degree do you think the survey designers felt that this was an opportunity also to peek into just American society generally,
Yeah.
as well as life in the military?
Yeah, it was reciprocal. It was useful information to the Army to understand their soldiers. But in the reverse, on the other side, for the researchers, it was they knew that they could. Obviously, it was just there were some soldier surveys with women, but it was so it wasn't the entire population. But they knew from the cross sectional dimensions of these surveys that but they would glean lots of information uh, of the general population. And the thing is, this research unit was embedded inside the organizational structure of the Army. This research unit was embedded in morale services, and so the people that they were directly serving were providing films, entertainment, orientation, uh, the books that were read by soldiers, informed by the surveys. And so you had lots of mass culture being produced to serve the American public through the Army, through these soldiers, and they were keenly interested in knowing how they were received. I mean, if you're sending out millions and millions of books, you want to know who wants to read what. So buried, as it were, within the survey data, there's a lot of information about 1940s American culture. The one thing that would add to the characteristic of the U.S. Army, they're for long periods of time, for most of U.S. history, there's a lot of pent-up resentment or questioning or skepticism about having a regular army. And you're absolutely right that the great majority of people who served didn't have military experience. But on top of that, one of the things that they found out really early on when they were surveying is that the US Army was a different army in World War II than it was in World War I. And it was a much better educated, more educated army. And so that was really quickly identified in connection with it being a citizen soldier force. It's also a better educated and a force that had more civilian skills that the Army needed, but also higher expectations. So there was lots of friction in the beginning, and then throughout the war between enlisted men and officers. And this unit was trying to help with that problem. But it grew out of a lot of expectations. If this is a citizen soldier army, then it needs to listen to the voices of the individual soldiers who were serving.
So, to what degree do the responses illustrate differences between the army then and the army now? Because it's talk of democracy and citizen soldiers. Um, but there was a war and a draft, so it's a much different circumstance than say how the army is made up today. Is
Yeah.
does that any of that come out? Like, what kind of picture do we paint of the army here?
Absolutely, absolutely. This notion that America's army was a democratic army and it was a citizen soldier army was not just a reflection of the power of public opinion polls or just the binaries that were created ideologically, that democracy against totalitarianism. Those were certainly were feeders, but the U.S. passed the draft in September of 1940. So if you know the calendar, that's well ahead of Pearl Harbor. And that period of time between the passage of the draft in September of 1940 and December of 1941 was hugely significant in how the Army thought of itself and the soldiers and the public. So the idea, and when they were drafting people during that period, it wasn't to send them to war, but to train them, prepare them. And so really early on, the leadership knew that the way that soldiers felt about the Army during that period was going to affect the public and public opinion about that military. So as you can imagine, knowing that they would need the support of the public, they were ever mindful of how they were training these soldiers. And that's where the researchers come in and basically sell their services, realizing how important the happy soldier was for morale, not only within the military, but within the larger public.
So,
And so I'm just going to add to that. You asked for the contrast. So I think, now we have become so aware of the fact that so few people serve, and I think that one of the reasons so many people embraced the surveys, the soldiers who embraced them and wrote what they wrote, was this sense of empowerment that that they had been drafted, so there needed to be a trade-off. They had been taken away from their families, they had been taken away from their jobs, and so the Army should use those skills, and that there should be more of a reciprocity based on that service at a time when we weren't officially at war.
so okay, apropos of the Democratic Fighting Force, now this project sort of democratizes the task of processing these primary source materials. Could you speak to that
Yeah.
aspect of the project a little bit more in detail? Like what value derives from working through beyond the obvious? I mean, certainly we get through it faster, but speak to the value of the crowdsourcing aspect, both for the project itself and for those participating.
Yeah. So one of the before I even imagined this project and before I embraced crowdsourcing and we did any of this work, the idea of the citizen scientist has been out there. That's an ethos and a set of practices and now technologies and platform that invite the volunteers and the public to contribute to research. And so the language that's used is quite deliberate around these projects of thinking of people contributing their time and their efforts as a service, as a form of citizenship, of civic activity and contribution to larger aims. So for me, knowing going into this project about this language of the citizen soldier and this way of thinking about democracy and service, it's just came really naturally to think of the contemporary practices associated with crowdsourcing through this research in just a really complementary way. And so I've never specifically said, put the two together as the citizen soldier and the citizen archivist or the citizen historian. In my mind, there's just lots of overlap, particularly as I was seeing that, our top transcribers have transcribed thousands of documents, some of them over 10,000, which is a tremendous amount of labor, but dedication and a sense of purpose and mission. And that's what they wanted for the citizen soldiers, is for them to be dedicated when they weren't being paid in the way that they might have otherwise or had wanted, certain expectations. But that sense of service, civic sense of service. So for me, crowdsourcing is a reflection of these much older ideas of civic duty and responsibility and giving and whatnot, within a very modern, technologically forward-looking and innovative platform and set of practices.
So then, anecdotally, is that your sense of what has drawn some of the more prolific transcribers to this project, a sense of sort of citizenship?
Yeah, I think so. And for a number of the most active transcribers, but also a number of my soldiers, students. See, I'm sliding myself here back and forth. Uh, there was some personal connection, a relative who had served in the Army and they knew about, or served in World War II, not just in the US Army, but others as well overseas. And I think that the intimate personal nature of the project mirrors that intimate familiar relation to the war. Obviously, there are military history buffs, people who are interested in tactics and strategies, who are connected to it. But you have lots of people who have contributed because of the familial connections. Uh, so there's lots of mirroring that across both. You start with the sources themselves. The contributions are from individual soldiers, but then here on this end, individual transcribers, and just throughout, it's really focused on individuals and their very human responses to war and very human responses to reading and transcribing these documents, the sense of intimate connection.
Yeah. Well, what about your connection? So,
Yeah.
regard to um, your own research more broadly, like, could you speak to what you hope to draw away from this project, or what drew you
Yeah.
to it in the first place?
Yeah. So my background is in the history, intellectual history and cultural history, but more specifically, the history of the interdisciplinary social and behavioral sciences. And a lot of my emphasis in this field has been on the notions of social adjustment. And well, working on my dissertation at Rutgers University, I was focused on conforming the 1950s and social adjustment in the 1950s. And the figure of the veteran just kept on popping up. And I knew then that there was a strong connection between ideals and ideas of 1950s conformity and the experience of the 1940s. And so I knew, I've really got to tackle World War II. I'm going to understand the 1950s and the culture of conformity and social adjustment. Uh, so when I first came across these sources, I had a sense of the intellectual context around the project before I even started reading the sources. I knew some of the social scientists who were involved. But two things drew me immediately when I started to read these sources. The first was on how frank and open and raw they were. Uh, I was surprised. I really was surprised. I expected them to be more polite or a little more guarded in their responses, and they absolutely weren't. In conjunction with that, I was drawn to a number of the sources that I had originally encountered in 2009 that were written by Black soldiers. And the way that they talked about segregation and Jim Crow in the military uh, didn't shock me. And we know about Jim Crow in the military and segregation and what they imposed, but to hear these individual voices and to read their responses, both those that were really well crafted and very rational and made very persuasive arguments, but also from African American soldiers who uh, didn't appear to have the same education. They were expressing very similar responses, reasonable responses to serving, and hearing all this rhetoric about the democracy and citizen soldiers, and they're being denied those basic rights. But in conjunction with that, you had lots of white soldiers who came into the military and felt like they were being treated more like slaves. And what I recognized really early on was a common set of language. And so obviously it was more extreme for the African American soldier, but there was a leveling effect for so many of these Americans. And they started to use some of the very same terms. Like you would have Black soldiers talking about not wanting to be treated like a dog. And then you would read a response from a white soldier saying, I don't want to be treated like a dog. Um, so it was both intimate and personal and raw, but then as I stepped back from the sources, it really helped me to understand the 1940s and World War II in a way that I never could have appreciated or hadn't before. And that's really what has motivated this project, is knowing that other people in the public and other scholars would have similar responses, I think, or would find them, if nothing else, interesting. But I think it ultimately will help inform our history of World War II and American culture in this period.
Great. Great. So we're making these videos as a way to sort of mark the end of the crowdsourcing phase of the transcriptions, and also to celebrate and appreciate that accomplishment. Um, so it has me naturally curious then, what's next for the project? What is the phase following this one?
That's right. So as I said in the beginning, we have a 2-year grant from the NEH to complete this project. So this phase is to basically produce the data that we're going to use. At the same time, over this last year, we've been parsing survey files that were in an old ASCII format, and we're reformatting those. And for some of these sources, we're going to be able, we think, to connect the survey data, the quantitative survey data, with these handwritten responses. But we're not going to be able to do it with all of them. But in the end, we're going to be creating this website to make all these sources available. And as you can imagine, that's a big job when you're talking about 65,000 written responses that have been transcribed, but also all the survey data that goes with it. We have over 200,000 individual level responses from surveys. And so this really is an interdisciplinary project of trying to bring together both social and behavioral science data with the humanities, and to create a website that pulls both the quantitative and qualitative data together. So over the course of the next year, we're going to be working with, we have a great web design agency, Portland, Oregon, Cast Iron Coding. We're going to be working closely with them, and we've already started to design that website. So there's going to be lots of cleaning of the data while we're designing the website. And our goal is by next spring to launch the website with all of these sources.
So the website, then, it's you're talking about an online repository or archive of the transcriptions as well as the microform images, or?
Yeah, we know there a few things are going to happen with our website. One is that we want to make sure that the historians and the public have access to those original images. So they're not just looking at the transcription, because there's so much you can learn and glean from having those or original sources. And some of them actually have cartoons on them. And there's no way to translate into the words that content. So we're going to have the two of those together, but also the survey data. And so currently, we've got a team of data scientists who are not only helping to parse that data, but also employ some natural language processing and some advanced techniques to mine and harvest that data. Because when you have that quantity, you don't want to just dump all of those sources on the public and say, hey, figure this all out. So we're going to have some contextual essays that highlight certain themes that are going to be, and that's going to be available on the website. But in addition to that, we're using some of these computational techniques to highlight themes in the sources and to help to bring everything together to bring some coherence to this project that has lots of disparate voices.
Yeah, I was wondering that if you were going to have or attempt to build like you say, contextualizing essays around different themes, or the work of scholars who use these sources, pointing to, so it's sort of like an epicenter for, so not just a repository for the sources, but also a way to see the scholarship that derives from it. Sounds like there's going to be some attempt to do that.
Definitely. So if you're not familiar with all the services of the U.S. Army, when the morale services, you wouldn't necessarily know about Yank magazine and the surveys having to do with Yank magazine, or about particular rations. What food items were in rations and eggs or chewing gum versus biscuits. There's lots of little details you wouldn't know to search for, so you're going to need a little bit of guidance. And this is true not only of the public, but also for scholars to get the sense of the range of the content, because they really did survey them about uh, not every facet necessarily, but just myriads of facets of military service. The types of the clothing that they wore, that was used, the cloth that was used in uniforms, laundry services. It's just a broad range. And so that's why we're going to have those contextual essays. So it's not just a repository for these digital assets, but also helps to start tell a broader story of morale in the U.S. Army in World War II and how the War Department looked to the social and behavioral sciences to help build and sustain morale during the war.
Yeah, so the project continues, and it sounds like there's still a lot to do, and
Yeah.
in perpetuity, really, that this is an ongoing thing in terms of its maintenance. So I'd like to finish, if we could, by saying a little bit about the team responsible for all this up to this point and how you envision it moving forward. You've said often throughout this conversation, we this, we that. So
Yeah.
who is this we?
So this is a really interdisciplinary project, and it continues to grow. So we've partnered with university libraries, with you and VT Publishing, and there are several people involved in that. And your predecessor, Amanda French, uh, who helped to design the Athenaeum, she was on the project originally. And so there was a really close connection between university libraries and history from the beginning. There was also an established relationship with the Department of Computer Science. Professor Kurt Luther and my colleague Paul Quigley had a digital project and has a digital project called Mapping the 4th of July. And I built on that and worked with them, that team as well. But it has expanded. We have data scientists who are at the University of Virginia who are on the project. Obviously, the National Archives has been instrumental, and we have worked closely with them, and they've digitized these sources. And so we have an advisory board with some really terrific historians. Amanda French is on it, and so they're helping to guide us in our the scholarship and making sure that we maintain scholarly standards. And the data science side continues to evolve. We also have a sociologist, Michael Hughes, who's on the project, and he has a background in social psychology and military psychology. He's on board, but really for me, as I was writing about this earlier, it very much feels like a distinctly Virginia Tech project, because there's lots of expertise on campus that was already here and that I could tap into. And so it's really been a joy to work with some just really creative, generous practitioners and scholars here and elsewhere. And last but not least, the Zooniverse transcribers. We worked hard to engage them on talk boards, and we post a lot on social media to try to stay connected to them. But I think really over the last half year, particularly over the last couple of months, the relationship to our moderators and top transcribers has evolved and loomed really large in my own thinking. It's really easy if you're directing these projects to be really self-focused and think, how is this going to advance your career and your research agenda? But when I started to see the number of documents these transcribers were transcribing, it was really moving. And we've gotten to the point now that I really do think of our top transcribers and our moderators as part of the team, because without them, no less than the data scientists who are working on mining the data, without them, this project would not be where it is. When the final website is launched, it will only have been possible because of their contributions. And so I think of it as a really large team now.
And so it sounds like this project has really helped you to um, place a sense of your work, to gain a sense of how your work can be placed in a social context,
Yeah.
right? Both with regard to the remarkably interdisciplinary nature of the work being done and how that work lives in broader society, as you see um, through the crowdsource.
Absolutely. As I said before, there are lots of people that I've come into contact with or who've been involved in the project or have some relationship will tell me about a relative, and they knew about a relative who served. And so it's a point of connection. Uh, that's a very specific connection, but beyond that, I think with this project in larger social context, I've come to appreciate that the humanities in digital humanities projects aren't just about scholars packaging art and culture for the public to consume, as I've said in a couple of the conversations, but they're co-creators. And that's what I see as the power of crowdsourcing and what Zooniverse has afforded and what it has allowed. It's allowed the public to be co-creators of the humanities using this really innovative digital platform.
Well, that seems like a great place to leave it. Dr. Gitre, I really want to thank you for talking with me. It's been a pleasure, but also offer congratulations on the work up to this point and good luck in the future of the project.
Thank you, Joe. I appreciate this conversation. It's been great.